Imperialism, Neoliberalism, Stalinism. It is jointly hosted by the School of Humanities and English departments of the Ateneo de Manila University and the Faculty of Creative and Cultural Industries, the University of Portsmouth. I'd like to thank the staff of both universities who have made this event possible, in particular Tom Sykes, who initiated it. I am Roderick Galam, and I am pleased to be chairing this panel discussion. I will try to make my introductory talk as short as possible to give more time for our speakers to present their ideas and allow for more time for more Q&A. In 2015, Maria Ressa noted that Rodrigo Duterte, and I quote, is brazen in what he plans to do if he wins: establish a dictatorship that would discipline Filipinos, that would establish law and order, that would eradicate corruption, and that would bring growth and development. 5 years on since his election in 2016, and although Duterte has succeeded in imposing a dictatorship or fascist government, corruption is rampant, the economy is in bad shape, to put it mildly, and his idea of law and order, his drug war, has resulted in the killing of almost 30,000 Filipinos without ever making a dent on the drugs problem. He has utterly failed to deliver on many, if not all, of his campaign promises, from putting an end to contractual labor, to solving Metro Manila's horrific traffic problem, to personally riding a jet ski and plant the Philippine flag in the Spratly Islands or Scarborough Shoal and defend the country's sovereignty from China's encroachment. Filipinos are suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic, to which Duterte has shown deliberate obtuseness and ineptitude. Community pantries that are providing relief to thousands of hungry citizens are being red-tagged. A commenter wrote on a post promoting this webinar in the Philippine Studies Group Facebook page, "Ang labo naman ng topikong pag-uusapan." Well, Duterte is truly muddled. He is incoherent, as Richard Haydarian has noted, following Duterte's long-winded speeches, often resembling Faulknerian stream of consciousness, if not Freudian free association, rather than the business as usual stream statesman-like sloganeering, is, to say the least, a formidable task requiring utmost patience and diligence on the part of any conscientious researcher. What the presenters will certainly demonstrate today is their ability to make sense of the morass that is Duterte and the context that makes it possible for a figure like him to emerge and dominate Philippine politics. As the abstract for this panel states, the academic analysis and journalistic reporting of Rodrigo Duterte has often failed to engage with several important material determinants of his rise, amongst them the recent complicity of Stalinist groups inside the Philippines, the long-term impacts of Western neoliberal economic policy on Philippine society, and the legacies of US colonialism. The four scholars on this panel will provide a corrective to these oversights. Let me then introduce to you the four speakers. The first one will be Dr. Oscar Campomanes, who will present on Dutertismo, Empire's Veritable Wet Dream or Perfumed Nightmare. Dr. Oscar Campomanes is Associate Professor in the Department of English at Ateneo de Manila University, where he also holds the Francisco C. Delgado Professorial Chair. He was a visiting scholar in the Department of Cultural and Religious Studies, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and was also a distinguished visiting professor at the Vietnam National University in Hanoi. He has held teaching appointments in various American universities, such as the University of California, San Diego, New York University, University of California, Berkeley, where he held a tenure track position, Williams College, and Yale University. He obtained his BA from the University of the Philippines and his MA and PhD degrees in American Civilization from Brown University, where he wrote on figures of the unassimilable American Empire, Filipino-American post-coloniality, and the US-Philippine War of 1898 to 1910s. He is a pioneer in the application of the transdisciplinary and translocal discipline of Gnosology on American Empire Studies and Filipino post-colonial critique, or the island forms of American Empire and Filipino post-colonial conceptuality. His work on this conceptualizes a distinctly Filipino and vernacular strain of global Gnosology, which he calls Philippine Archipelagic Maritime Studies, and has led to a course he teaches at Ateneo called Imperial and Post-Colonial Gnosology. He will be followed by Joseph Iscalins, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. The heart of his scholarship is a transnational approach to revolutionary movements and authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, grounded in the post-war political history of the Philippines. His forthcoming book, The Drama of Dictatorship, Martial Law and the Communist Parties of the Philippines, is forthcoming in 2022 from the University of Wisconsin Press. And this book analyzes the events leading up to the declaration of martial law by Ferdinand Marcos in 1972. It uncovers the prominent role played by two communist parties, the PKP and the CPP, in this affair. Using the previously unexamined contemporary written record produced by these organizations, it demonstrates that the rival parties allied with rival factions of the elite who were engaged in a furious struggle to be in power prior to the imposition of military rule. Joseph obtained all his degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, where he was recognized for his teaching excellence, and he has also taught at the San Francisco State University. His research interests include the Sino-Soviet split in Southeast Asia, global Maoism, and recovering the forgotten struggles of the working class and peasantry in the Philippines, as well as Tagalog literature. He speaks very fluent Tagalog, and that's because his family moved to Manila when he was 5 years old and lived there for many years. He also spent several years as an adult in rural central Luzon. Our third speaker is Tom Sykes, who is a widely published author, editor, journalist, and literary historian with interests in travel writing, creative nonfiction, international relations, radical politics, post-colonial literature, historiography, psychogeography, and historical materialism, as well as community journalism. He recently launched his book, Imagining Manila, Literature, Empire, and Orientalism, which is a critique of Western literary representations of Manila's urban topography and social ethnic communities, and the relationship between these constructions and the colonial and post-colonial histories of Europe, the United States, the Philippines, and wider Asia. Prior to Imagining Manila, he published The Realm of the Punisher, which is a political travelogue of the Philippines, which, according to the Times Literary Supplement, conveys in an affectionate and patronizing tone the many layers of injustice that run through the Philippines, and uses interviews and site visits to try to explain the eccentric ways and popular appeal of its more muscular leaders. Tom's journalism has appeared in Private Eye, New Statesman, The Scotsman, The Telegraph, New Internationalist, Monocle, New African, Red Pepper, Travel Africa, Southeast Asia Globe, and numerous print and digital media around the world. Tom obtained his BA from the University of East Anglia and his PhD from the Goldsmiths College, University of London. We should have a fourth speaker, Walden Bello, and I will introduce him when he joins us, hopefully later. So we'll have Oscar first. Oscar, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Derek, for that generous introduction. I just wanted to check if my audio and video are coming across all right. Thank you. I wanted to screen share and just for an instant flash this meme, which I downloaded from FB Stream, without here flashing it without any commentary or exegesis. And you can treat it as the visual epigram, right, for my remarks today. Good evening to everyone, and hi from Manila, the Philippines. What else is there to say about Duterte? Frankly speaking, I'm not interested in Duterte. I find it almost pointless to dwell on his obviously calculated political iconoclasm, what Tom Sykes, our roundtable organizer, calls his aberrant brutality, his unabashed misogyny, and his admittedly most quotable, mealy-mouthed pronouncements about all sorts of things under the sun. Ninochka Roscoe, interviewed for Publishers Weekly in 1988, upon the release of her debut supra-realist novel, State of War. That's the term she uses to describe her style, that it's not magical realism, but supra-realism, was asked if the character of the commander in the novel is an allusion to the erstwhile dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. Her reply, in essence, Marcos holds no interest for me whatsoever. Paraphrased wildly, the rest of her statement goes, Marcos and his ilk bore me to tears. But this is the exact quote. Marcos is just another dictator, and we all know what happens to dictators, end quote. Even if they rise, prevail for what seems like an eternity, they ultimately and eventually fall. I will say of Duterte what Roscoe has said about Marcos. He bores me to tears. He holds no interest for me at all. Like all would-be dictators, he is bound to fall. So my remarks today do not concern him as a personage at all. An approach toward my subject that I wish to take today borrows from an experimental, but I believe productive form of writing and critique developed by my leading colleagues in the Asia Theories Network, or ATN, a transnational group of critical and culture theorists, which is jointly coordinated from National Taiwan University and the University of California Humanities Research Institute. It is a network in which I have been active for the past few years, since its founding. We have given the name provocation or provocations, sometimes thought piece, to this form of discourse. Its chief technique is having the provocateur or speaker surrender epistemic privilege. And this is a term I borrow from Caroline Howe's magisterial study of Philippine elite and ilustrado formations, as well as literary and social understandings and representations of them in modern Philippine culture. In surrendering this epistemic privilege, the speaker is really interested in provoking or actively eliciting animated exchanges and deliberations in our workshops about the questions at hand. The provocation may take any form: images, formulations, rhetorical questions, handy quotes from strategically selected texts, etc., or any combinations of them. So my first provocation is actually that meme, right, that I flash at the beginning with no exegesis or commentary about the images of authoritarianism that it juxtaposes. And I will leave it for your critical consideration during the forum to discuss what it tells us as an image. My second provocation consists in a set of formulations which speak to my own intent to express the call for a radically new language in which to conduct our conversations and critiques about the problem at hand. One that seeks to move beyond Orientalist and imperialist rhetoric and representations, and might enable us to think about our present problematic on Duterte or Dutertismo in alternative ways. So here goes. When Tom first invited me, along with Walden, Joseph, and Derek, to participate in this roundtable a few weeks ago, I must admit that I hesitated about saying yes, even as I enthusiastically, I wish to apologize for my dogs. I have 4 of them and they're making background noise. Even as I enthusiastically welcomed and endorsed his idea for it, particularly the way his first draft for the roundtable abstract framed its problematic, to wit, that the proper name Duterte would not so much designate the real historical figure who bears it, as delineate an entire discursive formation, Dutertismo, which, as I understood then, was not going to be limited to a critical exposition of the highly controversial political style of governance associated with Duterte, or to which it has been distilled in the hands of the neo-Orientalist pundits, whose recent reportage on the phenomenon of Dutertismo is the main critical object of Chapter 6, titled Call of Duterte, Cacique Despotism and Western Neoliberal Crisis, of Tom's recently launched and released book, Imagining Manila. This discourse and practice of Dutertismo, as I took it, could thus be posed as a matter of formation or formations, not of forms. There's a crucial difference between the two. The initial roundtable description, to my mind, offered a certain promise, calling or hailing us, the prospective participants, to consider doing and to attempt to do something different, which is to avoid treating Duterte and Dutertismo itself as ultimately reducible to this real historical figure's, quote, gruesome necropolitics and sociopathic personality, unquote, which is the default mode emphasized and elaborated by his many and multitudinous critics, neo-Orientalists, and concerned locals in the Philippines alike. In the eventually revised formulation for this roundtable's mandate, I personally resonated with the productive proposition that Duterte, or more aptly now, Dutertismo, is the product of both, quote, long-term and short-term determinants, end quote, hence the main topical title, Determining Duterte, or what we in cultural studies would call over-determination or multiple determinations: economic, political, historical, cultural, or in a word, social. I would urge people to read the Duterte chapter of Tom's book, for there he proposes, and this is why we cannot expect to derive any enlightenment from the rather predictable, mentally slothful, and thus intellectually impoverished repertorial and critical writing penned by authors who are implicitly or often unwittingly operating from classic and neo-Orientalist premises and paradigms. In that chapter, Tom names some of these long-term determinants of the seemingly insoluble problem and interminable phenomenon of Dutertismo, with which we are confronted, or if you like, cursed. Critiquing establishmentarian and liberal journalists like Jonathan Miller with his 2018 volume Duterte Harry, or James Fenton and his recent reporting on our subject for the New York Review of Books, Tom points out that, quote, absent from their registers are terms such as neoliberalism, US imperialism, and Western propaganda biases towards the non-Western world, end quote. Here it is important to note that these terms, neoliberalism, which I expect Professor Bello to discuss extensively, or US imperialism, for examples, are not just terms to describe the larger and historical as well as contemporary determinants of Duterte's rise to power and that of his not so distant forebear, Marcos, and their commonly authoritarian style of governance. These terms can set the very terms for critical and more nuanced discourse making and representations of the Philippines' late colonial predicaments under such regimes. My own term for Duterte is that he is only the latest, although iconoclastic spawn, so that's my term, spawn, of the political culture to which we give the name cacique democracy, a glaring oxymoron if there is one, and it is a term coined by the late Benedict Anderson in a highly influential article. I prefer actually the term formulated by the Filipino historian Ruby Paredes, colonial democracy. Again, a contradiction in terms. The kind of political culture, therefore, fostered by the USA in the Philippines as a consequence of its pragmatic decision during its formal rule over the archipelago to develop and rely heavily on a comprador elite to serve as its administrative surrogates, given its inability as an empire following general American disenchantment with this one and major experiment of the powerful nation in imperial hegemony to recruit and deploy enough proconsuls to do the job from the ranks of its own citizenry. Interestingly, Tom in his chapter hires the related but extremely suggestive strain. So this can bring us back to the meme, no? Duterte is merely a strain of the original virus, right? To do the work of critical description of our object in this respect. It was in the context of citing in his Duterte chapter, Nefertita Dior's critique of Philippine political economy under the US-directed neoliberal turn characterizing the late 20th century. This is a black quote from the book. As Tadjar cogently observes, it was precisely the unintended consequences of self-interested Western policy towards the Third World in the late 20th century that laid the groundwork for Filipino politicians of Duterte's strain. There you go, the word. And here, citing Tadjar, quote, the rise of a strongman regime was a World Bank endorsed response to the growing and intensifying crises felt in the nation, that is to say the Philippines, as a result of the political and economic system installed by US colonization, here being pushed to its limits by the acceleration of global capital, end quote. In sum, my own provocation here boils down to a question of political culture. When we can, speaking of spawns and strains, think in alternative ways of overdetermination with respect to Dutertismo. This is, of course, in addition to the question of neoliberal political economy suggested by Tom's citation of Tadjar's critique. Yet another aspect, and I'm concluding, of these larger and long-term determinants of the problem and phenomenon we are examining as well concerns what Tom terms, quote, the totalitarian drift in Philippine politics as Duterte embodies and represents it, and relates to Tadjar's critique as cited. The blind spot commonly shared by neo-Orientalist commentators, which prevents them from recognizing that their own classic and neoliberal ideology has been, to borrow from Pankha Mishra's formulary, quote, an incubator of authoritarianism. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Oscar, for that fascinating talk. Let me now just introduce Professor Walden Bello, who will speak next. Professor Walden Bello will talk about the political economy of an authoritarian insurgency. Walden Bello is currently the International Adjunct Professor of Sociology at the State University of New York at Binghamton, and co-chairperson of the Bangkok-based Research and Advocacy Institute focused on the Global South, which he co-founded in 1995. He served as a member of the House of Representatives in the Philippines from 2009 to 2016. As a human rights activist since the Marcos era, he is currently active in opposing the anti-human rights policies of the administration of President Rodrigo Duterte. As a human rights and peace campaigner, academic, environmentalist, and journalist, and through a combination of courage as a dissident with an extraordinary breadth of published output and personal charisma, he has made a major contribution to the international case against corporate-driven globalization. He was awarded South Korea's Su Sang-don Prize in 2001, and in 2003, he was given the Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize for outstanding efforts in educating civil society about the effects of corporate globalization and how alternatives to it can be implemented. The Belgian newspaper Le Soir called Bello the most respected anti-globalization thinker in Asia, and the Canadian author Naomi Klein has called him the world's leading no-nonsense revolutionary. Chalmers Johnson has hailed him as the world's best guide to American exploitation of the globe's poor and defenseless. Bello is the author and co-author of 25 books. I'm not going to list them down here. He is a prolific thinker and author, and he obtained his PhD in sociology from Princeton University with a dissertation on the roots and dynamics of revolution and counter-revolution in Chile. There, he lived in shanty towns following Salvador Allende's rise to the presidency. And before he joined the Philippine Congress, he was a full professor at the University of the Philippines at Tiliman until 2009, when he retired from teaching at the university. And previous to that, he also taught at the University of California, Berkeley. So, Walden, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Professor Galam. I have tried to, that was sort of a kind of a CV that was prepared for elections. So I've been trying to get that out of my website, but so far unsuccessfully. But Tom, I guess I gave you a very short one, Tom. And in any event, thanks. Okay, let me begin by saying we are now close to 1 million infections in terms of COVID-19. And the fatalities rate has moved to over 15,000 people. We have had a second wave that has been quite devastating. And as Professor Galam said to you from the very start, the Duterte administration just doesn't know what to do. It's running around as one of the broadcasters here that used to be sympathetic to him, like a headless chicken, as that was the description of Mr. Tulfo. Now, will this make a difference in terms of Mr. Duterte's popularity? I'm not sure. And my whole presentation here is, in fact, discusses or goes to the roots of why I am not sure why, if this will have an impact on Duterte's popularity. In 2 months into the presidency of Duterte, I used the F word for him in discussion at the Ateneo de Manila University. And describing him as a fascist then did evoke some disagreements from friends, if that was in fact an appropriate description of the man. Well, 5 years and some 27,000 fatalities later in the Duterte's so-called anti-drug war, where the extrajudicial executions has been pretty much seen by both local and foreign observers, as having been, the key method in accounting for this vast number of people who've been killed. Others would prefer to have more terms for him, like serial killer or mass murderer, which would be, sort of be a bit more, extreme than, what I originally described him to be as a fascist. Okay. Well, so what accounted for Duterte coming to power? Well, Senator De Lima, who is probably his principal opponent at this point, in terms of her courage in opposing him from her being isolated in Camp Crame, the police headquarters, characterized Duterte as one issue candidate. That he basically rode on the drugs and peace and order issue. Now, I both agree and disagree with Senator Lima. I agree in the sense that it was Duterte's genius, so to speak, that made him pick on an issue that practically all other major Philippine politicians running for office would not take on, because of a sense that it wouldn't work, or they would be seen as somehow anti-poor or anti-liberal if they took it on. The favorite political platform, of course, of candidates for office in the Philippines has always been populism. Populism in the sense of, I can obtain more material goods for you, and it is on this basis that they have mobilized, communities of the urban poor and other constituencies. Okay, and that's been the classical Philippine politicians' approach, has been populism. Duterte was not a populist. In fact, his running for office, he made a number of really brazen statements, saying, for instance, that what he was going to do was to fill the waters of Manila Bay with the cadavers of criminals. So he was almost being deliberately provocative, in terms of his incendiary law and order rhetoric. And so that's not, people like Binay and others avoided that kind of rhetoric. Now, there was certainly certain sectors of the population that appealed to, including sectors of the urban poor and informal settlers who were bothered with the drug problem in their communities. But principally, the appeal was to the elite and the middle classes. The sense of security that this is something that had not been addressed by many politicians, but Duterte put it in the forefront. And comparatively speaking, we can also see that other people of Duterte's stripe have done this successfully. For instance, in Brazil, with Bolsonaro. But I think, though, that the support for Duterte really stemmed from people projecting into him what they wanted him to be. Okay, and this is a very important in terms of the social psychology of movements, including extreme right movements or fascist movements. That basically, my sense is that they saw the iron hand that he projected as a patriarch, okay, as a disciplinarian that he would exercise against criminals, okay. They saw that iron hand as something that he would also use against corrupt politicians, against sectors of the elite, okay, and you know, basically, especially when it came to corruption, there was just tremendous, you know, dissatisfaction throughout Philippine society. And although that was not his major platform, it did seem like his disciplinary approach sort of resonated with people's desire, you know, for a you know, to deal with corruption. And of course, he was seen by many as the person who would finally right, you know, all the wrongs that had been experienced, you know, over the last several decades in terms of political promises, you know, for advancement, prosperity, but where, you know, over 30 years, you know, the so-called EDSA Republic that was founded in 1986 had foundered and had not uh, delivered. And I will go into that more at the end of this. Well, so uh, another thing that I would like to bring up here is, you know, that whether we like it or not, the guy is charismatic. Okay, now he doesn't have the same kind of charisma as Modi, which is the more inspirational sort. Okay, but he is charismatic in his own way. In fact, his brazenness and the way that he deliberately, you know, is misogynistic and provocative and anti-God. You know, somehow that mix goes into, you know, a charisma that I think accounts for, according to the surveys back in November, something like an 89 to 90% approval rating. So there is, you know, there is something in his appeal that cuts across classes and cuts across sectors. And again, when we look at charisma, we must always remember what Max Weber said, that we're not just, this is not just an innate trait in a personality, but charisma is also dependent on the viewer, the one, you know, that he relates to, that the charismatic person relates to. Okay, and I think that is very important in terms of understanding Duterte, the social construction of charisma in a context of many extremely dissatisfied, resentful, and angry people because of the failures of the previous political regime. So, among other things, I think what charisma does is, you know, something very interesting, you know, from my talks and interviews with people, they may not agree with everything the guy says or represents. In fact, they may disagree with, say, his, you know, policies on due process and human rights, but they're willing to give him the benefit of the doubt because they agree strongly on certain points. Okay. Now, for instance, let me just, you know, it has been remarked that, you know, quite a number of people who had been on the left joined Duterte, and in fact became partisans of his. I will not mention names, but when you ask them why, they had a sense that, okay, yeah, the guy is, we don't agree with what he's doing in terms of the drug war. He's killing people with extrajudicial methods, but he does represent a possibility for reform, of social reform. Now, in the first year or second year of Duterte, you met ex-progressives that thought that way, that, you know, they didn't agree with his extrajudicial methods, but when it came to the possibility of reform, social reform, um, you know, to make the Philippines less of an elitist system. That's what they were banking on, and why they were willing to sort of swallow some of their doubts about Duterte and his methods. So the last thing that I would just like to mention here has to do with the dissatisfaction with the 30-year-old EDSA People's Power regime that, you know, in 2016, it was its 30th year. I think that there was a great deal of across the board, you know, happiness, relief when Marcos got out. And what we had was basically, you know, a democratic republic that was reborn, as it were, with, you know, a human rights constitution, one of the most advanced human rights constitutions in the world, if you read it. But as the 30-year history unfolded, what we had was one disappointment after another. Okay, Cory Aquino promises land reform. Then she's the first to go back on it because her family, you know, she doesn't want to land reform the family estate, the, you know, the Hacienda Luisita. And that was, you know, a big setback. Okay, Ramos comes to power, Fidel Ramos, and what he does is he basically becomes the local agent of neoliberal policy. I mean, if you look at it, all the key neoliberal policies were set up under Ramos, okay, including the entry into the World Trade Organization, the tariff reductions that destroyed our manufacturing, and of course, you know, all the measures that were imposed by the WTO that has destroyed our agriculture. And then we had under Joseph Estrada and Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, the reign of corruption, especially under Gloria. And so there was just this sense that when it came to the elections of 2010, we had somebody running for president who seemed to have captured the pulse of the masses with his slogan, which said, "Kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap." There are no poor people where, you know, there are no corrupt politicians. Okay, this was Ninoy Aquino, the son of Cory Aquino. Okay, so he comes, you know, this administration comes to power. And in fact, my former party aligned with it. And I was initially one of the supporters of the administration as a representative of my former party in the House of Representatives. But what happens is, you know, that we begin to see the practice of double standards. You know, the regime or the Aquino administration goes after its enemies with the anti-corruption platform, but protects its people who are also, you know, seen as engaging in corruption. Okay, and the big scandal of the Aquino period was the disbursement acceleration program, which was thought up by his budget minister, but which really involved, you know, using political funds, presidential funds, budgetary funds, okay, in order to punish his enemies and to reward his followers. And there also was the refusal to accept command responsibility for what was known as the Mamasapanong massacre, okay, where Aquino ordered the police to go after a quote unquote terrorist at the behest of the United States. And when that failed, he refused to accept responsibility for it and put it down the line. In terms of just a personal note here, that's when I decided that I couldn't no longer remain in the House of Representatives representing a party that had allied with Aquino. And that's why I resigned back in 2015. Because it was just untenable, morally speaking, to support presidency that was practicing double standards. Now, the reason I go in some detail into this is I think that sets up the stage for the appeal of Duterte, that it was one of the big factors, that I think we also saw it in the case of Brazil. Okay, now in the case of Brazil, the previous regimes before the Workers' Party of Lula and Dilma were far more corrupt, than when the Workers' Party took office. But okay, the thing is, they were they did not have this moralistic image that they were going to tame corruption. Okay, and I think this was the same thing that happened with Aquino and his people like Rojas and that sort of thing. That when double standards begin to operate, then I think hypocrisy, has greater wages in terms of what it exacts than outright, dishonesty. Okay, so let me just say, therefore, that two things. One is when you look at the ideals of the 1987 Constitution and its political, social, economic ideals, and compare that to, in fact, what happened, okay, in the record, so that by the end of the government of Aquino, 28% of Filipinos were still in poverty. The inequality rate, like Gini coefficient, was one of the highest in Asia, and practically all social reform initiatives had failed. That sort of is very important in explaining why Duterte appealed. The final thing that I would like to end up with is in 1986, many of the people in the barricades on the forefront of the EDSA revolution, as it was called, or EDSA uprising, came from the middle class. Came from the middle class, both the middle class, as well as what Christophe Jaffrelot, the French economists describing India would call the aspiring middle class. Those sectors largely went for Duterte in 2016. And I would say that they continue to be the backbone of the support for him. Because the middle class and the aspiring middle class, okay, people not necessarily middle class in income, but aspiring to be, these are also what someone called the chattering classes. They're the ones that form public opinion, okay? And they're the ones that have been actively creating a consensus for Duterte, okay? And the poorer people, the lower classes, I think, to use Gramsci, they would be more of, I would say, passive consensus. Okay, I mean these are imperfect terms, but this, we grapple for these terms at this point in time. So let me just end by saying, that we hope that people will finally realize that this is a fascist regime that has led the country to nowhere. But at the same time, we must realize that the factors that have helped create it are very strong and will not easily, go away. My last word here is two things. One is, as an activist, I think that there are two things that we really must hold on to. First of all, we must hold the line on human rights and due process. That may not be as popular today as before, but I think that at some point, a new generation will respect the focus that we put on it, okay? And that I am quite confident that this coming generation of Filipinos, in fact, will really go back to our concerns and values on human rights. The second thing is, I think that, especially in 2022, any opposition to Duterte cannot just be offering a return to the old, not just offering, hey, let's, a return or what is perceived to be elite democracy, because that's just going to be perceived as a return to the yellow democracy. Because as you know, the color yellow has now become so pejorative because of its association with elite hypocrisy. But we do have to really offer a vision of a progressive vision that really puts equality and the realization of equality at the center of things, and participatory democracy. And that is the challenge, I think, to progressives. That is the challenge to the left. And unless we can make that vision more attractive than the kind of charismatic, kind of populist vision, a populist meaning, not the sort of material I give you, but the kind of Duterte populist vision, we might have a successor regime, that will in fact continue the transformation of the Philippines into an authoritarian polity. So 2022 is going to be very decisive. It cannot be fought on the terrain of personalities. It really has to be fought on the terrain of visions and programs. And there are, of course, people that say, oh, Filipinos don't appreciate programs. They just go with personalities and that sort of thing. I fully disagree with that position. I think continuing the same sort of personalistic politics is going to doom us, into a prolonged era of personalist dictatorship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Walden Bello, for that very insightful and rich presentation. I think there will be plenty there that we could discuss in the Q&A. Let me just remind the audience here that if you have any questions, please use the chat box to write them down, and we will read them later on during the Q&A. We'll now move on to Joseph for your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Derek. Just one moment while I share my screen here. Everyone should now be able to see my slides. Can I get a nod from you, Tom, if you can see? All right, great, thank you. Thanks very much for organizing this. This is a really fascinating and I think important panel dealing with a critical political question. presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, its origins, its trajectory, and its implications. My talk this meeting, morning, afternoon, evening my time, is Embracing a Fascist, how the Communist Party of the Philippines facilitated and endorsed Duterte's rise to power. I wish I could share Professor Campomanes' feeling of boredom with Duterte. I understand what he's attempting to articulate, but the feelings that I have are simultaneously one of horror and of outrage. And I want to lay talk a facet of what made possible the rise to power of Duterte in the Philippines. Professor Bello has laid out some really points that I think are helpful, and I will build off of some of them. In particular, the statement that Duterte's appeal was principally to the elite and the middle class. I think that is correct. I think that is the sociological basis of sort of the core of support for Duterte. And second, the outline of sort of elite democracy since 1986 was very useful, and I will be building on that as well. I think we can't understand the rise of Duterte in the Philippines as a national phenomenon. Certainly there are all sorts of national peculiarities, but we cannot overlook the fact that he emerges in the context of a rising tide of global authoritarianism, that he shares a common geopolitical DNA, a social DNA with Trump and Bolsonaro and the AfD in Germany and so on, that whatever their differences, there is nonetheless an unmistakable and concurrent rise of the far right. It expresses conditions of social crisis. It expresses preparations for authoritarian rule. The question for us is, why is this emerging? Why is it specifically emerging in the Philippines? And what facilitated this? Now, for my talk, I want to talk about the role played in this by Stalinism. At its outset, in order to be able to do this, I have to address the question of red tagging, which has become a sort of murderous McCarthyism under the Duterte administration, particularly over the last year. It is the assertion that anyone who is putting forward an oppositional perspective or is associated with a political organization that is opposed to the current social order or to the Duterte administration is de facto a communist, and that therefore they should be subject to harassment, etc., both harassment by non-state actors online and in person, and by the police and military. And make no mistake, this has led to a mounting death toll, people killed in their homes in police raids, etc. And it is necessary, therefore, to be explicit that when you are examining the political line of the left and of the Stalinist party and of what we will term the broad national democratic movement, I am not in any way associating any of these organizations directly with the New People's Army. One feels compelled to return to the fact that it is in fact illegal in the Philippines, and that what is going on is a fundamental assault on civil liberties. That said, it is simultaneously necessary to bear in mind that there is nonetheless a coherent political perspective that is shared by a broad view known as the National Democratic Movement, that shares a common political line with the Communist Party of the Philippines, an orientation, a national democratic revolution, and carrying of that out by means of various social mechanisms of alliances with what they have termed the progressive section of the national bourgeoisie. This then is the programmatic underpinning for the historical material that I'm about to lay out. It was given by the CPP and by the National Democratic Movement, was brought behind the platform of Duterte because of the perspective of Stalinism. Now, when people think of Stalinism, they will almost certainly and correctly think of show trials, purges, falsification of history, and all of the many brutal excrescences of the Stalinist bureaucracy that we know from the history of the 20th century. That is not incorrect, but it is, I argue, an epiphenomenon. It is the organic outgrowth of the essence of the matter. The essence of Stalinism is a political program that serves certain economic interests, the privileged interests of the bureaucracy in Moscow and Beijing, as well as certain layers within the countries where communist parties operated. What was that program? Now, I've gone into this in greater length, and I don't have that much time now. So I'm going to go into it in a somewhat rudimentary fashion. If you're interested, I would encourage you to watch a talk I gave last year. It's available on YouTube. It's called First is Tragedy, Second is Farce, and I explore this in more detail there. At its essence, Stalinism is a program of nationalism, and it dresses up this nationalism in the language of Marxism. But it puts forward the argument that in countries of belated capitalist development, the tasks of the revolution confronting the working class, the peasantry, the oppressed masses is not yet socialist. It is national and democratic in character, land reform, etc. And that because these tasks are not yet socialist, a section of the national bourgeoisie, this is the term used, the pambansang burguesia, is going to play a progressive role and should be allied with. And the history of Stalinism around the world, including in the Philippines, is a history of a series of attempts to form tactical alliances with sections of the elite in the name of the National Democratic Revolution. The alliance with Duterte was a particularly vicious example of this political program, dressing up a relationship with a section of the elite in the language of Marxism. The next prerequisite for understanding this phenomena is recognizing that Rodrigo Duterte was a known political type long before his rise to the presidency. It is not as if the kindly mayor of Davao was miraculously transformed into a fascistic figure when he was elected to office in 2016. Duterte was the head of death squads, paramilitary organizations, a vulgar fascistic figure from the 1980s until 2016. This was his political character. He shared it with a great many local mayors, to be blunt, but he was the mayor of a more influential city, Davao, and he was brought onto the national stage in the 2010s until he became a viable presidential candidate in 2015, 2016. This then is the character of Duterte. There was no mystery as to what he represented. It was a fascistic and authoritarian figure who was being brought to the fore. The Communist Party of the Philippines and its allied organizations, or its organizations that share a common political line with it, Bayan and company, cultivated relations with Duterte in Davao over the course of decades. I'm going to go through their role in facilitating his rise to nationalism of his presidency in a very quick fashion. But they cultivated relations with him, electoral relations over the course of multiple decades, benefited from it. Here you can see Duterte in 2015 in Davao speaking at the wake of an NPA commander, Leoncio Pitao. He's been given the stage by the Communist Party of the Philippines. The banner behind him reads, "Mabuhay ang Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas." You can see him standing in front of the hammer and sickle flag. Bear in mind, this is the red tag. Over the course of the 2016 election, the Communist Party of the Philippines and its various affiliated organizations threw themselves behind the Duterte candidacy. They had, in fact, formally allied themselves with the candidacy, but in the southern islands of the Visayas and Mindanao, organizations such as Anak Pawis, Anak Bayan, Bayan Muna, etc., campaigned for Duterte. They did not, in fact, campaign Grace Poe. When Duterte was elected to office, the Bayan Muna representatives, Nakpawis, etc., from the southern Philippines, wrote a public declaration pledging their full support for Duterte. Duterte offered the CPP cabinet positions. The CPP said, "We can't enter your cabinet, but let me put forward the more progressive representatives that we select to fill cabinet level positions." Joe Masison, head of the Communist Party of the Philippines, began punctuating his declarations on Facebook with the statement, "Mabuhay si President Duterte, long live President Duterte." This image of Sison and Duterte by Sison on Facebook. It went beyond that. In one of the most vicious aspects of this, the Communist Party of the Philippines and the various organizations affiliated with its political line openly declared for Duterte's war on drugs. Now, make no mistake, people knew what this was going to be. Duterte, as Professor Bello correctly pointed out, was very explicit. He was very brazen in his statements during his campaign. 100,000 dead bodies floating in the bay, etc. These things were passed off as if they were somehow jokes, as if they were hyperbole, not simply by the mass media, other politicians, but by the various organizations of the National Democratic Movement. An Akbayan issued a statement in July. We believe that Duterte's campaign against dangerous drugs and crime is a boon to the poor. Joma Sison declared to CNN that the NPA would carry out revolutionary justice in Duterte's war on drugs because Duterte had issued an appeal to the armed forces of the Philippines that the NPA join in the war on drugs. Sison responded on CNN that they would do so, they would exact revolutionary justice. The CPP published a statement, Communist Party of the Philippines, that the NPA, the New People's Army, is willing to give battle with any who resist arrest with armed violence. This is revolutionary tokang. This is the same strategy that is being pursued by the police and paramilitary organizations of Duterte, and the CPP was offering to do so as well. Bear in mind that the CPP had, but months before this, declared that they were resurrecting their urban hit squads. Relations between Duterte and the CPP, however, were not to last. They soured. To a large extent, the breakdown in relations between the CPP and Duterte did not originate with Duterte and did not originate with the CPP. There was a straining on the part of the CPP to retain the alliance, to remain in the cabinet. The military, however, with the threats of coup, etc., several ties with the CPP relations soured. It's a complex phenomenon, but nonetheless, the impetus behind the souring of relations largely seems to have been in the AFP. The CPP and the various organizations of the National Democratic Movement insisted on remaining in the cabinet, and as late 2017 were demanding that they be approved to remain in the Duterte. Over the course of 2017, the CPP moved from enthusiastic support to expressions of public ambivalence. These are the effigy, actually it's one effigy, of Duterte that was being carried around in protests during the second State of the Nation address of the Duterte administration. The first entirely friendly on the part of the CPP. The second, however, carried this extraordinary image. On one side, you see Duterte, the militant raised and militant salute. On the other side, Duterte is Hitler. This is their public ambivalence. He might be a revolutionary, he might be, we're not sure yet. Let's pressure him, let's criticize him, let's see what comes about. Now, the CPP was thus instrumental in securing behind this sort of middle class and elite enthusiasm for Duterte, the illusion that this figure, this fascistic figure, who has now racked up a body count of nearly 30,000 people and is overseeing an apparatus of both malign neglect in response to COVID, as well as a war on drugs that is a campaign of mass murder against the poor. They whipped up enthusiasm for this figure to the best of their ability in the working class, the peasantry, and the poor. To the extent that those layers were passive, that passivity was something that the CPP sought to dissipate behind this figure, bringing all of that energy back behind Duterte, creating illusions in this figure. They were not, however, alone in bringing Duterte onto the national stage. In this process, the elite opposition of today were in fact responsible. A great many of the ruling elite were responsible for bringing Duterte forward as a viable national political figure. Not because they were unaware of his character, but precisely because of it. As social heightened, it was necessary to begin cultivating relations with sort of populist but Aryan figures. Duterte was the Davao chair of the party from 2009 to 2015. And it was in fact a liberal. You can see him here quite chummy with Noynoy Aquino in 2013, that first brought Duterte forward as a national political figure. It must be said, done while the Liberal Party was in an alliance with Akbayan, similarly a party of the left. Well, you, Professor Bello, were a representative of Akbayan. There is a similar sort of support for a section of the elite that spirals into making this possible. It brings me then to what I regard as the critical historical question. What is the response to this? Why was it that we saw this succession of disillusionment, as Professor Bello outlined, of Aquino and then Ramos and then Estrada and then Arroyo and then Aquino and now Duterte? And Duterte possible precisely because of this long line of disillusionment. Result of the fact that many of these figures had been trumpeted as being candidates of reform by the politics of Stalinism. The illusions in Aquino did not simply stem from the energy of 1986, but rather also the energy that the CPP invested in the year 1986 in cultivating the possibility that she could be a candidate of the left. They hailed her. It was not until the Mendiola massacre of 1986 soured. Similarly, there was support for Arroyo as she took office and facilitating the removal of Estrada from power. The Bayan and Company attempted to act in 2009, 2010 and failed, and therefore backed Villar. In every single one of these instances, these figures have been promoted by the politics of Stalinism, the politics of using the program of nationalism as a means of endorsing a section of the elite. Then is what makes possible the rise of a fascistic figure like Duterte. This is what makes possible the rise of fascistic figures the world over. It is the failure of the left. I agree with Professor Bell's conception that what is necessary is not a return to the old, but a programmatic alternative. That is not, however, what we currently see on the landscape. We see in the two images on my slide here. One, people waiting in line for aid for COVID. And we see a catastrophic grip at the working class, poor, and peasantry in the Philippines today. But the political opposition is being organized at present behind the groups inside. Now, there may be some new, but Bayan is a coalition that is presenting a united opposition to Duterte, to be frank, on the basis of elite politics. They are putting forward a list of possible candidates for president. Some of those candidates for president are closely tied to Duterte. Isko Moreno is one of the possible Bayan. But Isko Moreno was part of Duterte's cabinet until 2019, when he became mayor of Manila. He defended the war on drugs. Another candidate of Bayan is Antonio Trillanes, who was responsible for multiple military coup attempts. Democratic figures. And yet, Bayan has received the support of Bayan Muna, Partido ng Manggagawa, and Laban ng Masa, of which, Professor Bello, you are national. I would argue that he put forward the perspective of the political independence of the working class and not an alliance with the state. I think that is a critical component of what has made Duterte possible. Thank you. I'll hide.
Thank you, Joseph, for that fascinating presentation. Hopefully we will have questions about your talk from the audience. Tom, it's your turn.
Thank you, Derek. I don't profess to have the same, anything like the depth of knowledge about the domestic political situation in the Philippines as my colleagues who you've just heard from. But what I am interested in, what I've been researching for some time, is the ways in which Duterte has been represented in the Western media. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. Since 2016 and the election of Duterte, a relatively small number of Western authors and journalists have laudably tried to educate the largely blasé Western public about the Duterte regime, rightly drawing attention to its faux left populism, state authoritarianism, or we may as well just call it fascism, I think, cynical nationalism, toxic masculinity, and perhaps most appalling of all, its extrajudicial slaughter of narcotic suspects and political adversaries. However, this coverage is hampered by a good deal of confusion, hypocrisy, inaccuracy, and omission, in my view, not least because its exponents occupy points on a very narrow political spectrum, conservative at one extreme through to left liberal on the other, that is delimited and informed by neoliberal market forces. These include dwindling funds available for rigorous fourth estate reporting, especially of foreign affairs, the financial incentivizing of superficial clickbait and journalism content, and the sobering fact that in the US, just 15 billionaires with not particularly progressive political views, let's be honest, own almost the entire corporate media ecosystem. And in the UK, just 3 large companies own 83% of mainstream outlets. And it's going to be mostly about British and American journalists and other sorts of writers that I'm going to be talking about. When I say West, it's a somewhat homogenizing term, maybe. One of the consequences of this political economy of the media is that most so-called journals of note in the West offer partial, unreliable explanations for how Duterte's Philippines came to be. And their vocabulary is bereft of certain important factors that have already been alluded to by Walden and Oscar and others. Neoliberalism, US imperialism, then and now. And certain kind of Western ethnocentric ideas about not just the Philippines, but about the non-Western world. And let alone any awareness about the certain kinds of Western state corporate media biases towards the non-Western world, which are long-standing and you might say even legendary, but not for good reasons. The British Channel 4 News foreign correspondent Jonathan Miller's 2018 book, Duterte Harry, is an intensively researched blend of biography and reportage that provides a multi-fronted critique of Duterte's gruesome necropolitics and sociopathic personality. While to his credit, Miller acknowledges that poverty and inequality contributed to the popular disaffection that helped Duterte win the 2016 election, Miller's preference for a global trade system that disproportionately benefits Western economies as part of that sort of expression of that preference. He warns that Duterte challenges, I think a bit of an exaggeration this, but he warns that Duterte challenges the very stability of that international system, may explain why Miller does not address a key material cause of Dutertismo. As you know, Sir Walden said, who spoke earlier, he has asserted that in the 1980s and 90s, the US-dominated World Bank and IMF plunged the Philippines into extreme debt and massive poverty by imposing free market trade, industry, land, and spending reforms. Alienated from this economic and political order, swathes of Filipinos voted for Duterte's heady populism. And Walden gave you a kind of more detailed explanation of that particular historical context just now, so I won't sort of go on too much about that. But suffice to say, you won't read that in the sort of hegemonic Western media text that I'm talking about. And nor has there been any mainstream mention outside of one New Statesman article from May 2018 of the ways in which the West has more recently and directly aided Duterte's ascent. Over the last 4 years, the British government has approved £87 million worth of arms exports to the Philippines. This is some stats from the campaign against the arms trade. You can see some other relevant statistics that sort of tell us about Britain's sort of financial relationships with the Philippines when it comes to arms and weapons. From the sort of American perspective, President Joe Biden, hailed, I think, by over-optimistic centrists as a major improvement on Donald Trump, who of course got on famously with Duterte when he was in power, is in the process right now, if what we read is to be believed, of vending $2 billion worth of assault helicopters to the Duterte regime. By excising these economic and historical contexts, Miller and other Western writers' representations of Duterte as the aberrant bogeyman leader would seem to be misleading, if not hypocritical. Hypocrisy also distorts the moral calculus that Miller and others apply to Duterte's misdemeanors, encapsulated in Noam Chomsky's aphorism, "When they do it, it's a crime. When we do it, it's not." A May 2016 think piece in The Guardian makes the highly tendentious point that Duterte is more of a threat to the world than then US President Trump. While Duterte has slaughtered perhaps 30,000 Filipinos, he is incapable of attacking people beyond his own borders. whereas US military actions have killed up to 4 million in the Middle East alone since 1990. These actions have included, and people in a meeting like this will know this, these actions have included, and in some cases continue to include, the extrajudicial drone strike killings in Asia and North Africa, and of course the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan that made a mockery of international law and normalized torture and kidnapping. As you'll know, Duterte himself has lambasted such interventions. He's specifically named Libya, Panama, and Iraq in the press. You know, Miller, other writers like Jonathan M. Katz of The Atlantic magazine have rightly, I think, called Duterte out for whataboutism, or what is more formally termed the tu quoque fallacy, in which an argument consists in retorting a charge upon one's accuser. Duterte's ham-fisted strategy here is to cynically rebuff scrutiny of his own crimes by appealing to vulgar nationalism and anti-Americanism, as if the fact that Americans slang poor people all over the world somehow justifies him slaying poor people in his own country. However, attempts by Western liberals to level the tu quoque charge ring hollow due to their almost pathological inability to recognize that, as mentioned earlier, Western governments themselves have much more egregious records of violence. As the philosopher Andrew Spear argues, tu quoque can be used legitimately to question whether a particular moral principle is in fact one we endorse, and if so, whether everyone is consistently following it. And another issue on which Duterte has played the tu quoque card is the International Criminal Court, ICC's, investigation into him, which began in February 2018. While we should again seriously doubt the sincerity of Duterte's complaint, it does nonetheless speak to a pressing practical problem. How can Duterte and leaders like him in the post-colonial world, developing world, whatever you want to call it, be reasonably brought to justice when notable lawyers, academics, and UN officials even have repeatedly excoriated the ICC's erratic treatment of Western and non-Western state crimes? After examining the US's lack of liability for its actions in Vietnam, amongst other colonial wars, and stating that Western corporate impunity remains rife, the Secretary General of the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, Wolfgang Kalleck, concludes that the practice of double standards will have to be addressed to protect the ICC against erosion of legitimacy and global endorsement. Needless to say, there is no consideration of the uneven moral landscape of international law in Miller's half-page disquisition on the ICC, nor in any of the dozens of reports on the topic by other Western pundits. It is not in their interests to raise the subject, for they would have to admit that the case against Duterte is in part driven by a conception of human rights, as so the Filipino historian Vicente Rafael holds, essentially a form of imperialism, the West dictating to the non-West the norms of proper conduct. These norms are particularly problematic, continues Rafael, because the UN rapporteurs are lecturing the Philippine president about human rights from a location that is historically responsible for their daily violation. When Michael Peel of the Financial Times argues that another reason for Duterte's success is his mining of a seam of anti-US sentiment, Peel only briefly and uncritically mentions acts of US imperialism that might have fueled this sentiment. Similarly, Miller remarks on a rich vein of unresolved colonial angst in Philippine society, but does not elaborate on the potential rationales for this angst. The Philippines was the Americans' first overseas colony, he writes nonchalantly, acquired from the Spanish after a short war in 1898 for $20 million US. His deployment of the euphemism acquired would lead the less informed reader to believe that the US conquest of the Philippines did not require the grisly racist genocide of the Philippine-American War. By contrast, the Filipino historian E. San Juan Jr., as well as other colleagues here, Oscar has sort of written about this too very eloquently, have pinpointed continuities between these US aggressions in the late Victorian period and its present-day counterinsurgency maneuvers against both Islamist and Maoist rebels around the archipelago. US troops are recolonizing the Philippines, writes San Juan Jr., to preserve its eroded world hegemony post-Cold War and post-9/11. Unfortunately, Miller is as ignorant of these latest abuses by the American empire as he is of those from 1898 to 1902, or even into the 1910s, if we talk about the full extent of the Philippine-American War. His only comment on such matters is US forces were operating in Mindanao in support of Philippine army operations against the jihadist Abu Sayyaf group. Miller's assessment is typical of observers bedazzled by the rhetoric of the romantic relationship, to use Neferti Tadiar's metaphor, between the US and the Philippines. Miller's claim that American military support for the Philippine state against a common enemy implies equal democratic partnership, as Tadiar would put it, but San Juan Jr.'s description gets closer to the material truth of the matter. The Philippines is yet another sovereign nation that the US is manipulating as a battlefront in the so-called war on terror. This Western media discourse imposes similarly discordant ethical principles on Duterte's pivot to China. The Guardian laments that surging Chinese investment in the Philippines and an apparent climb down by Duterte in a dispute with Beijing over territories in the South China Sea is tantamount to a surrender of the US alliance, not in the better interests of the Filipino people. But this case excludes some vital nuances. While it is true that Beijing has poured money into the Philippines, this does not mean Duterte has turned his back on the US, however anti-American his fustian can be. The US is erecting new military facilities in the archipelago and remains a more valuable trading partner to the Philippines than China, just about, if you look at this latest table of top trading partners according to the criterion of countries that imported the most Filipino shipments by dollar value during 2020. And at any rate, Duterte is not the first president to play what's been called a cat and mouse game of maintaining good relations with the US while improving relations with China. And again, my colleagues here would be much better equipped to me to talk about the sort of long history of Filipino leaders, Marcos in the 70s, signing a joint agreement with Beijing and other sorts of overtures made to China while simultaneously trying to retain good relations with the US. Even supposing Western fears about realignment with China are well-founded, they are nevertheless predicated on a hypocritical assumption that China is a singular threat to Asian peace. Miller makes much of Beijing's remorseless militarization of the South China Sea while staying silent on the far larger and more provocative cordon of 400 American bases in countries surrounding China, some equipped with long-range missile capabilities. More to the point, unlike China, US armed forces are currently operating in 17 Asian countries, including the Philippines. While the official justification for this is once again the war on terror, Tadiar perceives the real agenda as the imposition of global martial law to ensure the obedience of crony states like the Philippines. Furthermore, as MGE Kelly avers, while we should be suspicious of Chinese pledges not to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, by contrast, the US arrogates a right to global interference in almost everything. Apparently, it is not militarization of Southeast Asia per se that bothers Miller et al., just the Chinese militarization of Southeast Asia. So this new military and economics-based Sinophobia has redrawn the textual map of Manila too. A May 2018 Bloomberg News article offers a snapshot of the daily realities of Duterte's Faustian pact with China. Restaurants serving Chinese hot pots and dumplings and Mandarin broadcasts at the Mall of Asia are catering for 100,000 recent Chinese immigrants, according to this story, whose arrival in Manila has profited several local companies. However, in keeping with the hoary old cliche about Chinese avarice, which again people will know is long-standing, people like Carolyn Howe have written about this in great detail, long-standing within the Philippines, but it's also a kind of stereotype that exists beyond the Philippine context. This human deluge, which is the word this writer uses, has also contributed to soaring house prices, which is a source of worry for one Manileño at least. I hope they become an asset to the community, he says of these new Chinese arrivals, and not just out to make money. In a further signifier of problematic cupidity, the Bloomberg piece states that dozens of Chinese gambling operations are setting up shop in the city, producing a boom that won't last forever. It is instructive to compare this foreboding representation of Chinese investment with the celebratory tone of a 2013 BBC report on how innovative technology is driving Manila's amazing call centers and BPOs, business processing outsourcing concerns, that are contracted to British and American firms. Rather than, as per the Bloomberg story, highlighting the risks of this burgeoning sector, call centers are presented as an unalloyed success that are fully sustainable thanks to government tax breaks, fast-track permits, and other perks. Whereas Bloomberg paints the expatriate Chinese workers and business people as a deluge that is culturally reshaping Manila and stoking anxiety among its indigenes, no such concerns are raised by several recent media accounts of Western retail chains opening branches in Manila, for example. This one rule for the West, another rule for China discrepancy is conspicuous in Miller's work too. Swift to admonish Duterte's spending program for leaving the Philippines in debt bondage to China, his phrase, Miller has, as I mentioned earlier, nothing to say about the World Bank and IMF's crippling loans to the Philippines in the last stages of the 20th century. I think it's really important because I've had criticisms for this in the past. I really think it's important to assert that the criticisms I've just made of these sort of Western distortions, these Western mediations of the current Chinese-Philippine relations do not and should not suggest a contraposition that in any way exonerates Chinese exploitation of the Philippines. I think all forms of capitalist exploitation, imperial exploitation, are wrong wherever, whether it's America or China or whoever else is practicing this. But that said, while there is certainly truth to the allegations that Duterte has sold out his country to Chinese interests, I think there's some truth in that. As with the Tu Quoque issue I mentioned earlier, when such allegations come from these Western observers, I don't think they can be taken all that seriously. So just to finish off then, really, ultimately this discourse of misrepresentations that I've been talking about, I think speak to, and this kind of relates to what Joseph was saying, he said very briefly at the beginning of his talk about these sort of wider international dimensions that we have to understand in order to really appreciate Duterte's rise. And I think this discourse speaks to a sort of liberal, a Western liberal stroke neoliberal worldview that is in crisis. Though these writers castigate the Duterte regime for its brutality, and brutal it certainly is, they deny any Western responsibility for this totalitarian drift in Philippine politics. Nor do these critics accept that their own ideology, despite its ostensible support of human rights and rules-based international relations, that term always makes me want to laugh or cry, I don't know, perhaps simultaneously, because it's so ridiculous, has, as the Indian essayist Pankaj Mishra puts it, been an incubator for authoritarianisms, I know Oscar mentioned this earlier as well, across the post-colonial world, and advocated for the occupation and subjugation of other people's territory and culture as a wonderful instrument of civilization. All right, thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you to all the, thank you, Tom, for that really interesting take on Duterte. We have time for a few questions, so I'm going to read from the chat box. There's one here from Inderjit Parmar. He says, thank you for two very interesting talks. You both alluded to comparisons between Duterte and Bolsonaro and Modi. I think this refers to Oscar's and Walden's presentations. There is a clear post-imperial and neoliberal element to the rise. I wonder if you could address any comparisons with Orban in Hungary and Poland's Duda. Is neoliberalism the key to the rise, or perhaps post-Soviet imperial legacies? Thanks. Would like to answer that question? Walden? Professor Bello, would you like to respond to that? Or any one of the speakers would like to give it a go?
Sorry, I think Professor
Okay.
Bello is.
Okay, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was muted. Would you like to go ahead, Oscar, please?
Oscar, you are on mute.
There you go. Oh my God, it's a common Zoom malady, isn't it? All right. First of all, I just want to declare I do not wish to be misunderstood about my expression of boredom with Duterte or about Duterte. Actually, as a professor of literature, I was attempting to be ironic um, concerning that expression of sentiment, no? To express also something of the sense of exhaustion, right? That many of us feel, not only about the mindless iterations of neo-Orientalist discoursing, right? About the political epidemic that's been ravaging the Philippines, as Walden has actually shown through this quick succession of post-Marcos and even post-independence political leaders and regimes. But also it was, although granted that it was a strongly worded attempt to produce what I've been calling a provocation. What I mean by that is that I wanted the discourse making to shift away from the formulaic and really rather unhelpful um, sorts of socio-political analysis and commentary that precisely Tom, in his presentation this evening, and in the Duterte chapter that I made extensive reference to, trenchantly critiques, right, for a good number of things, from their moral cupidity to their hypocrisy. But maybe my provocation is working because Joseph actually refers in internationally or globally contextualizing the rise of Duterte and not just talking about the Stalinist strain of support from what's left of the Philippine left as embodied by the CPP-NPA, which to him facilitated the rise of Duterte, despite the eventual breakdown in their previously amicable relations. This kind of it leads me back, right, like to this desire or call that I've expressed for a radically new language, new terms, maybe that we can mobilize to produce what I think we've all what we've been aspiring together as panelists, as more nuanced uh, analysis, more informative and critically enlightening analysis of this problem and phenomenon that Dutertismo represents. So a good example of that was like Joseph in, for example, internationally contextualizing the totalitarian drift in Philippine politics. Very interestingly used the terms DNA and RNA, right, to describe a certain reproducibility of, right, like this strain or viral or bacterial, right, basis in liberalism itself, classic or neo, that manifests itself and has manifested itself very concretely in real terms, not only in the Philippines, but in all these other places that he refers to, right? Okay, so by a radically novel or maybe alternative language and terms for analysis, I mean something like perhaps extending the metaphor that is suggested by the meme I flashed to you, right? Like where Marcos is the virus, right? And then Duterte is just a mutation of the original one. Meaning to say that what we really do need is, okay, extending the metaphor, is a new etiology. If Dutertismo is a disease, right? Like our current raging pandemic is actually furnishing us an alternative language for thinking about and analyzing Dutertismo. If it's a disease, right, we need to produce a good etiology of it so that we can then search for, right, the vaccinations or the vaccines, no, that we might require to address the problem. And in other words, what I'm saying is, again, extending it analogically too, is the metaphor is, before the pandemic, a political epidemic has been ravaging the Philippines and globally too, beyond the Philippines, since at least the Cold War, when the US empire entered into a series of partnerships with dictators, right? From Shah Reza Pahlavi of Iran in the 1950s to Augusto Pinochet in the 1970s, from Marcos, of course, in the Philippines to Miguel Noriega in Panama, right? And so it's a kind of global political epidemic. It's been with us for quite some time. And what I mean by constructing a new etiology is precisely posing this question of overdetermination, right? There's multiple determinants. And Tom, Joseph, I really appreciated also the kind of short-term determinant, the tactical one, right? That CPP-NPA support for and endorsement of Duterte explained for our sake. So I guess that's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm bored with Orientalist and neo-Orientalist discourses.
Could I just add
in
something?
Real terms?
What
Yeah.
you say, Oscar, is really interesting. We have a common interest in this because we've talked about this before, and I think maybe a step towards that new sort of language or new kind of discourse for understanding these sorts of very complex phenomena is precisely to acknowledge that there are all these different determinants. I mean that's that's nothing new. I mean that's historical materialism, isn't it? Which
Precisely.
yeah, but maybe obviously that there are new sort of developments in sort of new strains, as you say, of factors and drivers in someone like Duterte. And I suppose this is what one of the reasons I got interested in analysing this kind of very narrow sort of liberal Western sort of reporting on the Philippines is that it's very monocausal in its analysis.
Yeah, precisely.
And it attaches itself to these time-worn sort of, as you call it, neo-Orientalist cliches about there being something innately and essentially culturally problematic about Filipinos, that means that they all bow down to some sort of demagogue like Duterte, and that it's something in the genes almost, which is
precisely
a horrific sort of a social Darwinist idea. But it's not actually, that people, but it sort of survived and has been expressed more subtly, you could say, by some of these writers. I didn't, I only mentioned really a couple of the writers that I look at in the book. So I think moving away from that sort of monocausal analysis, moving away from personalizing this, again, there's that sort of, again, another liberal fallacy, isn't it? The great man theory of history, that it comes down to these big personalities. And of course, Duterte is a big personality and he gets the headlines when he, uses, he kind of spouts off his obscenities and turns up late for his press conferences. That it's easy to individualize that for well, not just the Western media, but probably for the Philippine media as well, and sort of, construct that as a kind of good story, a good journalistic story. But again, it would be too, it's far too narrow an analysis to assert that, Duterte became, who he is and is wreaking the havoc that he's wreaking simply because of, his individual personality or certain kind of actions that he took without understanding those wider contexts, I'd say.
If I could just jump in here briefly, originally, and we've sort of, I think the discussion has gone in interesting directions, but the question originally was about, I think, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and if that was a specific manifestation with Duterte or Bolsonaro. And I think the answer is absolutely. With the declaration of emergency powers in Hungary in 2020, which was granted by Parliament, was a response to massive inequality in the sort of Stalinist Hungary in the context of global capitalist crisis, and a similar sort of complicity from other sections of the ostensibly democratic elite facilitating the rise of figures like Orban or Duterte or Bolsonaro, has shades of the moment of making Hitler chancellor in 1933, in which the bourgeoisie effectively abdicate political leadership and say, fine, the Nazis can do it. And in that sense, dealing with this question of ideology, of its origins, of the strain that it represents, is a very valuable question, because it highlights the sort of the recurring nature of dictatorship in the 20th century and the character of US imperialism, which Tom's talk on the nature of sort of US role in all of this was absolutely useful in this. But one must also ask the question, not just of its historical roots, but of its contemporary simultaneity. Why is it all coming back now? Why is it all in the last 8 years that we are looking at, and massively sharpened with the COVID-19 pandemic? And I think the question has to deal with the crisis of capitalism that has never recovered from 2008, massive social inequality, the emergence of forms of social unrest that cannot be constrained within traditional democratic forms of rule, and authoritarianism as a tool in the arsenal, as you correctly point out, Oscar. They're bringing this as something they've used many times, but this is coming back around the world in a way that has to have a common use. It's not accidental.
Can I come in at this point and contribute to this fascinating discussion by the three of you? With respect to the original question, in terms of neoliberalism across Europe and Asia, I think one important difference between right-wing regimes like Orban and right-wing parties like the French rally of Marine Le Pen is that they have basically cherry-picked traditional social democratic positions, welfare positions on globalization, on welfare, and basically, I think that if you look at both Hungary as well as the program of Le Pen, what basically they say is, yes, it's this rights for you so long as you are of the same stock, the same color, the same language, so it's a sort of a welfare chauvinism that you find there. Whereas Duterte and Modi are more at this point espousing or tolerating or promoting the old neoliberalism. I think it's significant that when Duterte came to power, one of the things he said about his economic policy was that it would be, continuous with Aquino's policy. So there's, in fact, been, if you look at economic policies, there has been no change. And for all intents and purposes, it is economic technocrats that run that because, as he said, he doesn't understand economics. So he has given he's given full control when it comes to economic policy to his technocrats like Dominguez. And all of these are very, very neoliberal people. So that's one difference. The second point I think I'd like to make is that while Joseph has pointed to the role of the traditional left in the Philippines, and I have no disagreement with the general characterization, I think that we also must see that the left has played a role in Europe and the United States. I mean, we are talking about social democrats, Tony Blair Francois Hollande, the whole social democratic tradition in Europe bought into neoliberalism. And in fact, this is, and of course, if you look at the Democratic Party in the States as sort of a broad left party, it also bought into the Reaganist alternative. And, so that when it comes to the West, I think we're not just talking about elites sort of endorsing these people. We're talking about the traditional parties of the working class abandoning the working class by going for neoliberalism and therefore making them vulnerable to being recruited by this new right-wing fascist parties. So I think that's so I think that's one place where there's an interesting sort of similarity. And of course, when you look at India, I think that the rise with the BJP and the crisis of the left are also very much related, especially when you look at what happened in Bengal. The whole way that the ruling left there made a pact with a very big Indian family grouping, the Tata grouping, to create this big export processing zone, or that basically cost it eventually the appeal of the masses in Bengal, and led to the loss of power of the Indian left in large parts of India. So, yes, in terms of the role of the left, we shouldn't just look at, say, the case in the Philippines, but also India, the role of the the Workers' Party in Brazil. I mean, that's got to be brought in. The crisis of the Democratic Party, where it has been seen to have abandoned its large parts of its base, and of course in Europe too. So I think we should bring in the role of the left as a factor here. The only other thing I would like to make is a clarification, because Joseph did raise this. Well, first of all, yes, when Akbayan, which saw itself as a social democratic formation, in a new sense, allied with the Aquino administration back in 2010, it was seen as sort of a situation whereby that would be, an alliance in which we would push from the left in order to be able to gain the progressive reforms that would be possible at that point, as well as move the Philippines to a more independent position in foreign policy. Now, as I said in my talk, that did not, in fact, succeed. And basically, and the reason, why I left Congress was because I got very different in terms of my positions on Aquino than my former party. And the second point is more like the Laban ng Masa, of which I'm the national chairperson at this point, is not part of Isang Bayan. In fact, we've been quite critical of the way that it has been formed, and said that it comes at the end of a process. It's beginning at what should be the end of a process, rather than a beginning, which is a contention of programs, rather than this sort of backroom filling of positions by personality. So I just wanted to make that clear, Joseph, that I don't know whether you said we were part of, sort of, I got that, but no, we have definitely been quite critical of the way Isang Bayan has been formed at this point in time.
Okay, I think we can continue this discussion as long as we have enough participants. I can stay until 1:30 because there are many other questions here that I think we would be interesting for the speakers to respond to.
Sorry, Derek, can I just say I'm going to have to leave at 1:15, I'm afraid, because I've got another meeting, but I'm quite happy if people want to carry on. The recording will go on and then be saved at Portsmouth's sort of archives, and we'll upload that video to YouTube, in due course.
I'll have to go to it because I'm on another Zoom in a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I would the opportunity to respond to some of the points that Professor Bello just raised a second ago. Walden made, I think, a really good point about the role of the left universally, not just in the Philippines. And I had hoped that was clear from my presentation, but I'm glad that he brought that forward. It is decidedly not simply a Philippine phenomenon. This is a question that you mentioned, Hollande and company. Around the globe, the shift by forces ostensibly left into the camp of, that is to say, the capitalist reforms being dictated by finance capital, has been a critical factor facilitating the rise of the far right, which has been able to gain populist ground as a result. And I did not mean to imply that that was unique. In fact, my entire argument is that this is bound up with global developments, and the function of the left is of a similar character around the globe. The only other point, I was not saying that Laban ng Masa was a founding member of Isang Bayan, which I know includes Partido ng Manggagawa and Bayan Muna, as well as the right-wing Magdalo, which is a party of sort of originally founded out of coup-oriented sections of the military. But I know that Laban ng Masa did at least term Isang Bayan a breath of fresh air, and that you issued a statement that the comparison of various programs in a sort of primary sensibility would lead to the formation of a Biden-like candidate. You made the analogy to the elections in the United States, which I don't see that as a way forward at all. And my call for the independence of the working class is antithetical to such a conception, just to clarify.
Okay, thank you, Joseph, and thanks everybody. I do have to run, and it was a very fascinating discussion.
thank you.
Thank you.
Walden.
Thank
Sorry about the mix-up earlier. I gave you the wrong time. That's my bad.
No, it's okay.
Take care.
I will have to go too because I'm attending to a family emergency actually. Yeah, I told Tom about this, but thank you so much for.
Thank you, Oscar, as well, so much.
Okay, so I think, Tom, we can end the webinar now. Okay,
Good.
so thank you very much to all of you who stayed on. We went well past the time, but thank you for your patience and interest. So wait for the recording to be made available to you.
Thank you, Derek, for doing a superb job of chairing. And well, it was great. And thank you to Joseph. Thank you to Denise as well, our assistant, who's been helping with this. So hopefully we can do something like this again. It'd be great.
Thanks, everyone. It's terrific.
Thank
Bye.
you.